The diner buzzed with the low hum of conversations and clinking cutlery, a familiar sound that had become strangely comforting for David. Every Thursday, without fail, he brought his 7-year-old daughter, Emily, to this same booth by the window. It was their small escape, a ritual carved from the still raw grief of losing his wife 2 years ago. David smiled through the ache in his chest, watching Emily color a menu with the broken crayons the diner always offered. Her giggle at one of his dad jokes filled the booth with a warmth he desperately clung to. But that evening felt different. As he waited for their burgers and milkshakes, something across the room caught his eye. A woman, maybe around his age, was gently but firmly trying to wrangle 3 small children into their seats. One was crying, another refused to sit still, and the youngest kept dropping his spoon, giggling each time. The mother, despite the chaos, wore a tired but determined smile, the kind that came from holding it all together when everything threatened to fall apart. Her eyes darted around, half apologizing to the room, half pleading with her kids to settle down. David watched the scene with a pang in his heart. He recognized that smile. He had worn it himself, the mask of strength you put on for your child when you're falling apart inside. His gaze lingered not out of pity, but out of a deep, quiet understanding. Emily followed his eyes and whispered, "She looks like she needs a break, Daddy." David looked at his daughter, then back at the woman, and something stirred in him, an instinct, a pull. He didn't know her story, but he saw her pain, her courage, and above all, her love for her children. Without overthinking it, he knew in that moment, he had to do something. David gently called the waitress over and said, "Put their table on my bill too." She looked at him curiously and asked, "Any special reason?" David simply smiled and replied, "It's just a dinner." When the widowed woman, Aaliyah, found out a stranger had paid for their meal, she was stunned. She quietly walked over to David's table, eyes glistening with unshed tears, and softly said thank you. Her 3 children, for the first time that night, were laughing without worry, like a weight had been lifted from their small shoulders. In the midst of light conversation, Aaliyah hesitantly shared that they had no place to live. For the past few days, she and her kids had been staying in temporary shelters. Life had become unbearably difficult for her children. David fell silent for a moment, then gently said, "I have a spare room in my house. If you'd like, you and the kids can stay there for a week, just until you find something more stable." Aaliyah's eyes welled up. She lowered her gaze and nodded. Perhaps out of humility, or perhaps overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. His offer wasn't just about shelter, it was about dignity, support, and the safety a mother needs most for her children. That same night, they all shared one table, laughter echoing in place of loneliness. What began as a simple act of kindness had quietly started to become something far greater, a bond that, in time, would reveal itself as nothing short of a miracle. Weeks turned into months. The people who were once strangers couldn't imagine a day without one another now. Their Thursday dinners were no longer just a routine, they had become a bond. At that table, it wasn't just meals being shared, but pain, laughter, and those silent wounds no one talks about. Aaliyah, who had once been reserved and quiet, began slowly opening up. Her words carried sorrow, but also a strength that had survived countless trials. David would often watch her silently, in awe of how this woman, once a stranger, had so quickly become part of his heart, and his home. His daughter Emily had changed too. The little girl who used to sit in silence, lost in memories of her mother, now clung to Aaliyah with laughter and trust. She shared her tiny joys with her, like she'd been waiting for this connection. David noticed that the happiness and peace he hadn't felt in years were slowly returning. His home, once cold and quiet, now echoed with children's laughter, the shuffle of toys, and the comforting smells of shared meals. The walls themselves felt like they were breathing again. One evening, as laughter filled the room and the kids ran around playing, David looked at them all and felt something shift inside him, a quiet realization. The people he had once invited for just one dinner had now become the most beautiful part of his life. Those four faces, whose presence had transformed his world, were nothing short of a miracle. One evening, after a peaceful lakeside picnic, the sky was bathed in golden sunlight. The children laughed and ran across the grass while Aaliyah quietly packed up their things. David walked over and stood beside her. They shared a few moments in silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. Aaliyah glanced at David with gratitude in her eyes. She softly said, "Thank you, truly. You didn't have to do all this, but you didn't just help us, you gave us a reason to hope again." Then, lowering her gaze, she added gently, "We've stayed at your home for so long, maybe it's time for us to go. We'll leave tonight." Those words struck David like an arrow to the heart. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand. "No, you're not going anywhere, because your place is here, with us." Then, from his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box and slowly knelt down on one knee. Time seemed to stop. Emily squealed with joy, "Really? You're going to be my real mommy?" David opened the box and looked up at Aaliyah, his eyes filled with love, certainty, and a new beginning. Tears welled up in Aaliyah's eyes, and with a quiet smile, she nodded yes. The children clapped with joy, laughter echoing across the lakeside as the gentle breeze seemed to carry their promise of love through the air. In that single moment, the decision to leave became a vow to stay forever, a moment etched in their hearts for a lifetime. The wedding was simple, but the joy was immeasurable. In a nearby park, a few close friends, children, and heartfelt prayers gathered together, but the most precious thing of all were the 6 radiant smiles, glowing with the light of years of patience and gratitude. The same diner where it all began had now become their special place. That 6-seater booth, once a witness to loneliness, was now filled with laughter, stories, and the warmth of life's simplest, sweetest moments. They weren't connected by blood, but by something deeper, shared grief, love, and the miracle of second chances. David often thought back to that night, the night he simply paid for a stranger's meal. He had no idea he was actually beginning a whole new chapter of his life. He thought he was helping someone, but in truth, he was being saved too. Aaliyah, once a stranger, had become the light of his life. Emily, who once quietly mourned her mother, now proudly showed off her new mommy to anyone who would listen. And Aaliyah's children, who had once lived in the shadow of uncertainty, were now part of a home filled with love and laughter. This story reminds us that sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can bring about the greatest joy. What started with one meal turned into an entire family. The message is clear. A single step taken for someone else can often heal your own soul. Love can be reborn, families can be found anew, and a heart, once broken, can finally become whole.